room smelled like cedar and old money. There were 60, maybe 70 people arranged across my father's living room that evening, holding crystal glasses and speaking in the careful, measured tones of people who believe they have something to protect. The Harrington family reunion. Annual. Mandatory, in the way that things become mandatory when a patriarch decides his preferences are everyone else's obligations. String lights strung over the oak beams. Catered food from the firm downtown that did all the events for the county's better families. My Aunt Delphine was laughing about something near the fireplace. The sound of her laugh carrying that particular edge she only deployed in rooms where she wanted to be noticed. I had driven 4 hours to be there. I want you to understand that. 4 hours, in a car that smelled faintly of printer ink and cold coffee, because I still believed, at 34 years old, that presence was a form of love. That showing up mattered. That the act of returning again and again to a house that had never quite felt like home was evidence of something good in me. I had been back less than 40 minutes when my father made his announcement. He was standing near the bar cart, the one that had lived in that corner since before I was born. And he was in the middle of a conversation with my Uncle Gerald and 2 of Gerald's business partners from Asheville. I was crossing the room to refill a glass of water. Not to interrupt, not to insert myself. Just moving through the space the way you move through a space you've never quite been given permission to claim. He said it without lowering his voice, without pausing the conversation. As if I were not a person who could hear, but a subject, a topic, a thing to be categorized aloud. That one, he said, nodding in my direction, never quite figured it out. Brilliant at school, I'll give him that. But brilliant doesn't pay the mortgage. Some people just aren't built for the real world. Gerald laughed. A short, comfortable laugh. The laugh of a man who has heard his brother say something like this before and found it mostly harmless. I kept walking. I did not stop. I picked up the glass of water and I walked to the kitchen and I stood over the sink for about 90 seconds. And I breathed through my nose the way I had learned to breathe when I was a child in that house, and something had happened that I was not allowed to cry about. Then I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and I walked back into the party. That was 11 months ago. What happened after that is the story I want to tell you. Not a story about revenge, exactly. Not a story about rage. A story about documentation. About patience. About what it means to build something quietly, over years, in the margins of a life that other people have decided, without your input, doesn't quite measure up. My name is Daniel Harrington. I am the youngest of 3 children. My brother Marcus is 41 and runs a commercial real estate business in Charlotte that our father seeded with $120,000 when Marcus was 26. My sister Priya, who married into the family name and kept it, is 38 and manages a boutique in Raleigh that my father co-signed the lease on when she was 29. I received nothing. That is not a complaint. It is a data point. It matters only because of what it contextualizes. Our father, Robert Harrington, spent 30 years as a land surveyor and property assessor for Caldwell County. He retired at 62 with a reasonable pension, a house paid in full, and a reputation that he wore like a second skin. In Caldwell County, if you needed to know who owned what, which parcel abutted which ridgeline, which deed was clean and which had been signed by someone who no longer had standing to sign it, you asked Robert Harrington. He knew land the way some men know horses or scripture. It was the organizing fact of his identity. He was not a cruel man in the cinematic sense. He did not shout. He did not drink. He did not break things. He simply had decided, somewhere around the time I was 12 years old, and more interested in code and mathematics than in hunting or local politics, that I was a category of person he did not fully understand and therefore did not fully respect. He dressed this up in language about ambition and practicality. He said things like, "That's fine for a hobby," when I talked about the programs I was writing. He said things like, "But what are you going to do for real?" when I got a scholarship to study computer science at a state university. He said things like, "Academia isn't the real world, Daniel," when I finished my master's degree. What he meant, I understood later, was that he did not have a framework for what I was doing. It didn't look like what he knew. Therefore, it didn't count. I moved to Raleigh at 22. Then to Research Triangle at 25. When I took a job with a mid-sized software development firm that was doing interesting work in data infrastructure. I spent 4 years there, learning. Then I left, with 3 colleagues, to start something of our own. This was not a dramatic departure. We were not 22-year-old visionaries with a PowerPoint and a dream. We were experienced engineers who had identified a specific, unglamorous problem in how mid-market insurance companies manage their claims data. And we had built a specific unglamorous solution for it. We bootstrapped. We were slow. We did not raise venture capital because we did not need to. We had customers within 8 months. We were profitable within 14. I did not tell my father any of this in detail, not because I was hiding it, because I had tried, twice. And both times he had looked at the ceiling of wherever we were sitting and said something like, "That's good, Daniel," in the tone of a man who is waiting for the conversation to return to something he cares about. So I stopped offering. I kept building. By the time I walked into that party 11 months ago, our company, Haversfield Data Solutions, had 23 full-time employees, a client roster that included 4 of the 15 largest insurance carriers in the southeastern United States, and annual recurring revenue that I will not specify, but that had, 2 years prior, crossed a threshold that made my accountant rearrange his calendar to talk to me about tax strategy. My father called me a failure at a party attended by 60 people who knew his name. I stood in the kitchen and breathed through my nose. And then I went home, 4 hours south, and I sat at my desk, and I opened a folder I had been maintaining for almost 3 years. A folder that contained documents my father did not know I had. Documents that reframed the entire story of our family's property in ways he had never felt the need to explain to the child he'd decided, somewhere in the early 90s, didn't quite measure up. It started with my grandmother. Edith Harrington died when I was 19, in the fall of my sophomore year. She was 81. She had lived in the same farmhouse on the eastern edge of the county for 53 years, and when she died, my father handled the estate. He was the executor. He told us at the family dinner after the funeral that the property would be sold to cover debts and that the remainder would be divided. Standard estate settlement. He used that phrase. Standard estate settlement. He said it with the same authority he brought to everything involving county records and property law, which was total. Absolute. Not arrogant exactly, but the authority of a man who has been the most competent person in every room he has ever entered on a specific technical subject and who has let that competence bleed into a general assumption of infallibility. I was 19 and grieving, and I believed him. I went back to school. My brother was 26 and already building his business. My sister was 23 and planning her wedding. Nobody looked too closely. Nobody asked for the specific accounting. My father handled it, because my father was the one who understood land, and none of us had reason to question a man whose professional identity was the clean and accurate transfer of property. I did not think about the estate again for 11 years. Not consciously. It existed somewhere in the background of my understanding of our family, as a fact I had accepted without examining. Edith's house was gone. The land was sold. That chapter was closed. What reopened it was entirely accidental. In the spring of my 31st year, I was refinancing the condo I owned in Raleigh. Routine process. My mortgage broker sent me a checklist of documents, and one of the items was a copy of any inheritance I had received in the prior 10 years, for purposes of verifying asset history. I dug out the paperwork from Edith's estate. The check stub for $3,640. The single-page summary my father had sent by mail several months after the funeral, written on his own letterhead because he had been both executor and the person who drafted the accounting. I looked at that page for a while. I was not looking for anything specific, but something in how I had built my professional life. The habit of examining a system until you understood every input and every output made me want to verify the arithmetic. I looked at the claimed debt totals and the claimed sale proceeds and the distribution calculation, and I reached for a calculator and started plugging in numbers. The math did not work. The claimed sale proceeds of the property were $68,000. The claimed debts were slightly over $40,000. The claimed distribution was the remaining amount divided 3 ways, but I could not find any record of what property had sold for $68,000. The accounting did not name a buyer. It did not name a closing agent. It referenced a transfer but not to whom. It took me 3 weeks of evenings, working in browser tabs after my regular workday was done, pulling public records from the county assessor's website and the Register of Deeds and the Secretary of State's business registration database to find it. Here is what I found, 11 years after the fact, when I finally decided to look. The farmhouse had not been sold to cover debts. It had been transferred. Specifically, it had been transferred via a deed recorded in March of the year following my grandmother's death, transferring the property from the estate of Edith Harrington to a sole proprietorship called Harrington Land Holdings, LLC. A business that did not appear in any of the estate accounting my father had summarized for the family. a business whose registered agent, according to the North Carolina Secretary of State's online database, was Robert Allen Harrington, my father. The property, 14 acres with a farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, and direct access to a county road, had been appraised at $240,000 the year of my grandmother's death. My father had transferred it to his own LLC at an internal valuation of $68,000, a number that appeared in a single line of an estate inventory document that had never been shared with the other beneficiaries. The remainder of the estate after that transfer and a set of claimed debts that I eventually found no corresponding creditor for came to just under $11,000, split 3 ways. My share of my grandmother's estate, $3,640. I remember the check. I used it for textbooks and a winter coat. The actual value of what should have been distributed, based on the appraised value of the property and the absence of legitimate corresponding debts, closer to $75,000 per beneficiary. My father had, at minimum, dramatically undervalued and improperly transferred an estate asset into his own business entity, without disclosure to the other beneficiaries. Whether that constituted fraud under North Carolina probate law was a question I eventually took to an attorney. Her name was Catherine Voss. She practiced estate and trust litigation in Durham. She had short gray hair and a stillness about her that I came to associate with people who have spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money and have decided to find it mildly interesting rather than tragic. Catherine Voss looked at the documents I had assembled over nearly 3 years. The recorded deed, the LLC registration, the estate inventory, the original appraisal, the comparable sales data I had compiled from the county assessor's records showing what similar parcels in that area had sold for in the years surrounding my grandmother's death. The letter I had found, in a box of my grandmother's things that my father had given me to sort through after the funeral, and that he had apparently forgotten contained more than quilts and recipe cards. A letter in my grandmother's handwriting indicating her intention that the property be equally divided among her 3 children. Edith Harrington had not left the property to my father alone. She had expected it to be shared. The letter was not a legal will. It had no standing to override the formal estate process. But it was documentation of intent. It was her voice on paper saying what she had wanted. Catherine looked at all of it for a long time. Then she looked at me. "This is a strong file," she said. "How strong?" "Strong enough that I'd want to file a petition to reopen the estate. Strong enough that I'd expect a settlement conversation before we got anywhere near a courtroom. Your father is going to need his own attorney, and his own attorney is going to look at this and tell him something he probably doesn't want to hear." She walked me through the specific deficiencies she saw in the estate administration. Under North Carolina General Statute 28A, an executor owes fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries of the estate. Among those duties is the obligation to account accurately for all estate assets. Transferring an asset from the estate to a personally controlled LLC at a valuation significantly below market without disclosure to the beneficiaries, without independent appraisal at the time of transfer, and without approval from the clerk of court constituted a potential breach of fiduciary duty. The fact that my father had been a county property professional made the below-market valuation harder, not easier to defend. He could not claim ignorance of fair market value. He was professionally one of the people in that county most qualified to assess it. I asked her about the statute of limitations. She explained that North Carolina allows an estate to be reopened for up to 3 years after the issuance of letters testamentary in cases of fraud or misrepresentation. We were past that window technically. But the discovery rule, she explained, could extend that timeline when the aggrieved party did not have reasonable access to the information needed to discover the wrong. I had not known about the LLC. I had not been provided with the deed transfer. The estate accounting had never been formally distributed to the beneficiaries in the form required by statute. The 1-page summary my father had mailed on his own letterhead was not a compliant accounting. A compliant accounting required itemization of every asset, every debt, every transaction, and had to be filed with the clerk of court and formally noticed to the beneficiaries. None of that had happened. "The window is not closed," she said. "It's complicated, but it's not closed." I told her I was not in a hurry. She raised an eyebrow. "I've been building this file for 3 years," I said. "I can wait until it's right." I had started building the file in the spring of my 31st year, after the refinancing paperwork raised the first questions. I had continued building it slowly, carefully, in the evenings and on weekends, the way I had always worked on the things that mattered most to me. Without announcing them, without asking for approval, without being deterred by the fact that no one else was paying attention. I had requested certified copies of the recorded deed from the Register of Deeds. I had pulled the LLC's registration documents and annual reports from the Secretary of State's database. I had commissioned a retrospective appraisal from an independent property assessor who did not know my family and had no connection to the county. I had assembled comparable sales data for every transaction within a 5-mile radius of the farmhouse in the 3 years surrounding my grandmother's death. I had also, and this was the piece I had not expected to find, located 3 creditors listed in my father's estate accounting who had no corresponding filing in the county civil court records. In North Carolina, creditors making claims against an estate are required to file notice with the clerk of court. 2 of the 3 largest debt claims in my father's accounting had no corresponding court filings. The third had a filing that listed an amount substantially lower than what appeared in the accounting, which meant the claim debt total was inflated, which meant the distribution was doubly wrong, undervalued on the asset side, inflated on the debt side. I did not feel triumphant when I assembled this. I want to be clear about that. What I felt, sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning looking at documents that had been sitting in a county record system for over a decade, entirely accessible to anyone willing to look, was something closer to grief. A quiet, specific grief for the version of events I had accepted for 11 years, and for what it said about the person who had arranged for that version to be the only one available to us. What I did in the months that followed the party was methodical. I am by profession and by temperament a person who believes in systems. I believe in the rigorous documentation of states and transitions. I believe in audit trails. I believe in the clean, verifiable record that allows you at any point to reconstruct exactly what happened and in what order. These are not just professional principles. They are, I have come to understand, survival principles. They are what allows a quiet person to stand firm in a world that keeps trying to substitute narrative for fact. I had met with Catherine the week after the party. I had not called her because of what my father said. The meeting had been scheduled for 3 weeks prior. I sat across from her and I told her the file was ready and I was ready to proceed, and she said, "Are you certain?" And I said yes. She filed the petition the following Monday. I had Catherine file the petition to reopen the estate in October. Quietly. Through proper channels. The filing triggered a notice requirement, which meant that Marcus and Priya, as co-beneficiaries, were formally notified. Marcus called me within 48 hours. He was not angry. He was confused and slightly frightened. I explained the documents calmly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad handled all of that." I told him I knew. I told him I wasn't blaming him. I told him that the question before us was not about blame, it was about the accurate distribution of an estate that had not been accurately distributed. He said, "I'm going to need to think about this." I said, "Of course, take all the time you need." Priya called the next morning. She was angrier, though I'm not certain the anger was fully directed at me. She had 3 children. She ran a small business. $75,000 was not an abstraction to her. It was a number that meant something. I could hear her doing the math in real time on the other end of the phone. She said, "Does Dad know?" I said, "He will, when he is formally served." She said, "When is that?" I said, "Within the next 2 weeks." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I did not expect. I always thought there was something strange about how that estate was handled. I never knew how to say it. My father called on a Thursday evening in late October. I was in my office reviewing a vendor contract when my phone lit up with his name. I let it ring once, twice. I set down the contract and answered on the 3rd ring. "Daniel." His voice was different, tighter. It had lost something. "Dad." "I'm told there's been a legal filing." "Yes." "I'd like to know what you think you're doing." I said, "I'm exercising the rights of a beneficiary of Edith Harrington's estate to seek an accurate accounting of the assets distributed from that estate." He said, "I handled that estate properly." I said, "I have a different view of that, supported by documentation." He said, "I don't know where you got those documents or what you think they mean, but you are making a very serious mistake. You are going to damage this family." I said, "I want to be careful about language here. I'm not damaging anything. I'm responding to a situation that already existed. The filing is accurate and the documentation is legitimate. My attorney has reviewed it thoroughly." He said, "Your attorney." He said it the way he used to say, "your software," or "your computer programs," like the thing was foreign and slightly absurd. I said, "Yes. Catherine Voss in Durham. She practices estate litigation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want you to know that I did what was best for this family. I said, I understand that's how you see it. He said, that land needed managing. Marcus and Priya didn't want anything to do with it. You were away at school. Someone had to take responsibility. I said, the way to take responsibility for an estate asset would have been to propose to the beneficiaries that it be transferred to an LLC for management purposes, with appropriate compensation to the estate and documentation of each beneficiary's share of the equity. That's the proper channel. That's what the law provides for. He didn't say anything. I said, I want to resolve this. I'm not trying to take you to court. I'm not trying to ruin anything. But I need an accurate accounting. And I need the beneficiaries to receive what they were entitled to receive from Edith's estate. He said, you're doing this because of what I said at the party. And I paused. Because I had thought about this a great deal. I had turned it over carefully, the way you turn over a document to look for text on the back. I said, no. I've been building this file for 3 years. What you said at the party had no effect on the timeline. The petition was going to be filed. What you said at the party is a matter between you and me, and it's separate. He said, I don't believe you. I said, that's your right. But it's the truth. He hung up. The formal response came through my father's attorney, a man named Gregory Alcott, who had practiced property law in the county for 30 years, and who had, it turned out, been tangentially involved in the original LLC formation, which created its own complications, and which led to a supplemental filing on our end. Catherine was precise and thorough and entirely without drama about it, which I found deeply comforting. The settlement negotiation took 4 months. During those 4 months, I ran my company. I hired 2 new engineers. We closed a contract with a mid-Atlantic insurer that represented our largest single client engagement to date. I ran 3 miles every morning and cooked dinner most evenings and read, on weekends, the books I had been meaning to get to for a year. I did not spend those 4 months in anguish. I spent them in the ordinary texture of a life I had built, slowly, in a city 4 hours south of the one where someone had decided I didn't quite measure up. Marcus eventually aligned with the petition. He didn't hire separate counsel. He authorized Catherine to represent him as a co-petitioner, which she was permitted to do given that his interests were not adverse to mine. He sent me a text in January that said, I should have paid more attention to this years ago. I told him not to do that to himself. Priya became, in the later stages, the more active co-petitioner. She had her own attorney review the filings, and her attorney agreed with Catherine's assessment. Priya is formidable when she decides to be. I had forgotten that about her. The settlement terms are not mine to disclose in their entirety. They are subject to a confidentiality provision that all parties agreed to. What I can tell you is that they involved a formal valuation of the property as it currently stands, which is now significantly more valuable than it was at the time of transfer given improvements and market appreciation. They involved a payment to each beneficiary representing their proportionate share of the estate asset as it should have been distributed. They involved the transfer of a recorded lien against the LLC until payment was completed, and they involved a formal amendment to the estate record. An amendment that required, in accordance with North Carolina statute, a recorded correction deed, a legal deed, a document that was prepared by the county clerk's office and read aloud as required by protocol at the time of its recording. The county courthouse in Caldwell County has a records room on the 2nd floor, wood floors, high ceilings, a counter that runs along one wall behind which 2 clerks manage a constant low-level traffic of property filings, deed registrations, plat approvals, and the various documentary residue of a county's ongoing relationship with its own land. My father had spent 30 years in that building. He knew every clerk. He had navigated that counter hundreds of times in the course of his professional life. The recording of the correction deed was a formal proceeding, which is to say it was a bureaucratic step, not a ceremony. It did not require anyone's presence. The deed was filed. The clerk noted it. The record was corrected. But the Harrington family had connections in that building, and word travels in small counties. And there were people present on the afternoon that correction deed was filed who knew my father's name and who heard the clerk call it. My brother called me that evening. He said, I heard it got done. I said, yes. He said, are you okay? I thought about the question. I looked out the window of my office at the Research Triangle skyline, which is not dramatic but which I have come to find genuinely beautiful in the way that familiar things become beautiful. I said, I think so. Yes. He said, Dad's not. I said, I know. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know something. I've been thinking about this since October, about what Dad said at the party. And I want you to tell me what you've actually built down there. Not the summary. The real thing. I want to understand it." I told him. It took almost an hour. I told him about the bootstrapping, about why we chose not to raise venture capital, and what that decision cost us in the early months in terms of speed, and what it gave us in terms of control. About the first client, a regional property and casualty insurer in Eastern Virginia, and what it cost us to serve them properly before we had the infrastructure to do it cheaply, and how that client's referral to a second client was the moment I knew the model worked. About the year our lead engineer left for a larger firm, and I spent 4 months doing his job and mine simultaneously, which was not heroic but was necessary, and which taught me things about my own company's technical architecture that I would not have learned any other way. About the contract we almost lost because I had failed to communicate clearly with the client's IT team about a migration timeline, and what that experience taught me about the gap between being right technically and being effective operationally. About the year we crossed profitability and what I did to mark the occasion, which was nothing, because I was in the middle of a server migration and did not have time, and how I thought about marking it later and then didn't because the moment had passed and the work was just ongoing and that was fine. About the 23 people who currently depended on decisions I made, whose names and roles and individual situations I knew, and what it felt like to be responsible for that in a way that was different from being responsible for a line of code or a client contract. Marcus was quiet for a while when I finished. Then he said, "Daniel, why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" I said, "I tried, a couple of times. It didn't seem to land." He said, "I wasn't listening. I should have been listening. I didn't know what to say to that. So I didn't say anything." I let the silence sit between us the way silences can sit sometimes when they don't need to be filled. There is something I want to be careful about here, something I've turned over since October, through the settlement and the filing and the correction deed and all of it. My father is not a villain. I want to say that plainly because I know how these stories can sound. I know the shape that a narrative about a patriarch and a dismissed child and a recovered inheritance can take. I know what you might expect me to feel. I know what the satisfying version of this story looks like, where the man who said you're a failure gets his public reckoning and the wronged party stands vindicated before a crowd. That is not quite what happened. What happened is more complicated and, I think, more true. My father grew up in a county where land was the primary currency of stability, where owning a piece of ground meant you could not be entirely swept away. He watched his father lose a farm when the soil gave out, and the bank didn't care. And he spent his entire adult life becoming the person who knew which deeds were clean and which weren't, because knowledge of that system was a form of armor against the thing he feared most. He built a professional identity around being the authoritative keeper of those records. When his mother died and the estate came to him to manage, I believe he made decisions that felt, to him, like stewardship. He thought of himself as the one who understood land. He thought of himself as the responsible one. He transferred the asset to his LLC not because he consciously set out to defraud his children, but because he did not fully separate his role as executor from his identity as the person who was most qualified to make decisions about property. He conflated his authority with his entitlement. That is not an excuse. The law does not accept subjective self-assessment as a substitute for proper estate administration. The other beneficiaries had rights that were not honored regardless of his intentions. But it is an explanation. And explanations matter to me. Not because they change what happened, but because they change how I carry it. What I had to release, over the course of those 4 months, was the narrative in which his original failure to see me clearly was the cause of all subsequent wrongs. The estate situation was not about me. It was not about his opinion of my worth. It was a separate thing, rooted in his own psychology and his own complicated relationship with land and security and authority. What he said at the party was about me. And that is the wound I am still learning to hold correctly. He did not come to the mediation. He sent Gregory Alcott, which is within his rights and honestly probably the more legally sound approach. I sat across a table from Alcott and Catherine and a mediator named Richard Park for 6 hours on a Tuesday in February, and at the end of it there was a number on a piece of paper that all parties agreed to. I called my father that night, not because the mediation required it, because I decided to. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I want you to know that I didn't do this to hurt you. I want you to know that I'm not angry with you. I want you to know that the settlement is something I think is fair, and I hope you can eventually see it the same way." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I built things in this family." I said, "I know, I can see that." He said, "I gave Marcus his start. I helped Priya." I said, "You did?" He said, "I thought you didn't need it. I thought you were fine." And there it was, that word, fine, the word for the child you've categorized as self-sufficient, which in this context meant the child I decided not to worry about, which meant the child whose life I stopped looking at closely enough to see. I said, "I am fine, Dad. I've built something I'm proud of. I just needed you to know that it exists." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might have put down the phone. Then he said, "Your grandmother always believed in you. She told me that, more than once, that you were the one who was going to do something she couldn't quite predict. I did not know what to do with that. I still don't, fully." I held the phone and I looked at the ceiling and I breathed through my nose. The old way. The way I learned in that house. I said, "I wish I'd known that when she was alive." He said, "Me too." That was all. The county recorder's database is public. Anyone with internet access and a county name can look up deed records. It takes about 30 seconds. I have looked up the correction deed several times. Not obsessively. Occasionally. The way you check a thing that exists in a place where things are kept safe. It reads, in the clean, affectless language of official records. Correction deed, Harrington Estate, filed pursuant to settlement of petition to reopen estate. Beneficiaries Daniel R. Harrington, Marcus A. Harrington, and Priya L. Harrington Cole. Recorded this date, Caldwell County Register of Deeds. My name. On the document. In the place where my name was supposed to have been, always. I do not think of it as revenge. Revenge implies that the point was the other person's pain. The point was the record. The accurate, permanent, legally binding record that says what was true and what was owed. That is all I ever wanted. Not to be celebrated. Not to be lifted up before a crowd. Just for the record to be correct. Marcus and I talk more now. Not every week, but regularly. He asks questions about the company and I answer them, and sometimes I ask him questions about his work, and he answers those. We are learning in our 40s how to be brothers in the way we probably should have been in our 20s. It is slow and slightly awkward, and I think it is real. Priya sent me a long email in March about our grandmother, about memories she had from visits to the farmhouse that I didn't know she had, about the way Edith used to sit on the porch in the late afternoon and watch the light change on the ridge behind the property. She said she thought about that porch sometimes. She said she was glad the record was corrected. She said she wished it hadn't been necessary, and she also said she was glad I had the patience to build the file. I printed the email. I put it in the folder with the other documents. The folder has become, over time, something other than a legal file. It has become a kind of archive. A record of what I saw clearly and what I did about it and what came after. My father and I have not had another long conversation since the phone call the night of the mediation. He came to Marcus's birthday dinner in April. I was there. We were in the same room. He looked older. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like a man who was uncertain about something. He said, "How is the company?" I said, "It's good. We're growing." He said, "What is it you do again?" So I told him, simply, without the defensive precision I used to use, without the slightly deferential framing I always felt I needed when explaining myself to him. I just described it. Data infrastructure for insurance claims. Mid-market firms. We handle the architecture and the integration, and we've been profitable for 4 years. 23 people. He listened. Really listened, I think. Or tried to. He said, "That sounds solid." I said, "It is." And then someone called him from across the room and he turned. And that was the conversation. And I stood there for a moment and thought about what it meant that solid was what he had landed on. It is not the word I would have chosen. But it is something. Coming from him, at this moment in our lives, it might be as close as we get. I am not going to tell you that I have resolved this. I am not going to give you the version of this story where the family heals and the patriarch learns humility and the dismissed child finally receives the full recognition he was owed. That would be dishonest, and it would also, I think, miss the point. The point is not resolution. The point is clarity. I know what I built. I know what the record says. I know what my grandmother intended, and I know what she told my father, and I know that her voice, her actual handwriting in an actual letter in a box that was given to me in 1999, is part of the documentary record of this family now. It is filed, it is preserved, it exists. What I have learned, over 3 years of building a legal file and 4 months of navigating a settlement and a lifetime of being the one who drove 4 hours to show up at a party where he was categorized in 3 seconds as something that didn't quite work out, is this. Proof is not persuasion. Documents do not change what people believe about you. The correction deed did not make my father understand my worth. The settlement did not rewrite his assessment of who I am and what I've made of myself. What the documents did was correct the record. And the record is not for him. The record is not for the 60 people at that party. The record is not even for me, really, in the sense that I needed it to feel whole. The record is just the record. Permanent, verifiable, indifferent to anyone's opinion of it. My name on that deed means that the facts are what they are, regardless of the story anyone else was telling about me while I was building them. That is enough. It has to be enough. Because the alternative is to spend your life waiting for someone to finally see you clearly, and some people, through no particular malice and no particular cruelty, and just the ordinary limits of who they were shaped to be, are not going to be able to do that. And you can love them anyway, at a careful distance, without asking them to perform a clarity they do not possess. My father called me a failure at a party in October. The clerk read my name on the legal deed in March. Both of those things are true. And between them is 11 months of work that I am not ashamed of. And a file I built over 3 years that I am not ashamed of. And a company I built over 8 years that I am not ashamed of. And a life that is mine. Documented and real and not subject to anyone's assessment but my own. If you are the person in your family who has been quietly categorized, if you are the one who is called stable when they mean unremarkable, self-sufficient when they mean easy to ignore, fine when they mean I don't need to look too closely. If you have spent years producing proof of your own existence for an audience that has already made up its mind, I want to tell you something. Stop building for that audience. Build for the record. Build for the archive. Build for the version of the story that will exist when everyone else's opinions have dissolved into whatever comes next. The record outlasts the party. The document outlasts the room. The truth of what you made, the actual verifiable durable fact of it, does not require anyone's acknowledgement to be real. It is already real. It has been real the whole time.